Hey, how are you? SliceofOtaku, and considering our exposure to Team Avatar dealing with rather adult themes and conflicts in their youth, with the conclusion of the Last Airbender series, I'd often wonder what their adult lives would have been like. And in that sense, the Legend of Korra can at times be somewhat fulfilling when it comes to that desire. And although it didn't exactly provide as much in our former cast of characters as I would have liked, there were times when the series would depict the past in pretty interesting ways. And I think a good example of this actually comes from Korra Book 2, a season with a remarkably bad reputation amongst Avatar fans for obvious reasons. But regardless, I can't help but be fascinated by one side story in particular. One which provided some insight into the family dynamic of Aang and Katara's household. The Legend of Korra is often criticized due to the way in which its fictional world and the depiction of its story seem to, for the most part, solely revolve around its main character. And I feel like a big contributor to this issue would have to be the lack of a proper character foil. With the Last Airbender series, it was as much Zuko's story as it was Aang's. And with this narrative juxtaposition, their two paths were often parallel to each other, continually building up to some sort of intersection, which tended to, in some way, be symbolic or artistic storytelling. Whereas with the Legend of Korra, we have far more straightforward cutaways directly relating to the further progression of Korra's journey. However, the recounting of memories amongst Aang's children while visiting the Southern Air Temple was rather different. It really had nothing to do with Korra and doesn't advance her story in any noticeable way whatsoever. And so it's interesting simply for the sake of being interesting, which really shouldn't be as major as it stands to be, but whatever. With the conclusion of the Last Airbender series, we're gifted with the romantic union of Aang and Katara, which pretty much works as our fairy tale happily ever after ending. But with this side story, we're informed that it wasn't all sunshine and rainbows, and understandably so. As the Last Airbender, Aang had somewhat of a responsibility to the legacy and future of his people and to the world. It was up to him and him alone to bring about the return of the Air Nation. And so an airbender of a child was undoubtedly a sort of necessity for him. It's sort of like how historically, fathers born of nobility would desperately desire a son to be their heir. Together, Aang and Katara had 3 children. First was their son Bumi, a non-bender, second was their daughter Kaya, a waterbender, and finally, their youngest son Tenzin, an airbender. And now, although it's not explicitly stated, I'm under the assumption that an airbending child is something Aang and Katara continually aim towards, considering Tenzin, their only airbending child, happens to be the youngest of the 3. Not only that, but the visible age differences between these 3, at least in childhood, were all noticeable. With Bumi being their first child, there is no doubt in my mind that Aang continually checked him for bending potential. And although bending has existed for thousands of years, there isn't really any simple way to be sure if someone is a bender or not. And so with Bumi being a non-bender, it likely took a whole lot longer for Aang and Katara to be sure of his situation as opposed to if he actually was a bender. Which brings us to Kaya, who couldn't have been more than like 5 or so when Tenzin was born, which tells me she showed signs of waterbending really early on, very much like her mother Katara. And once it was clear to them that they had a waterbender on their hands, it was on to the next one in the form of Tenzin, the answer to their prayers. Now, having finally spawned the hope of his culture, Aang spent much of his time teaching Tenzin the ways of their people as to ensure a future for the Air Nation. Tenzin was trained to take up the mantle in Aang's stead and inherit his mission. However, in doing so, Aang ultimately neglected his other children, leaving them behind in favor of focusing on Tenzin and exploring the world with him. And of course, we all knew Aang to be a fun-loving guy, and so their shared adventures weren't entirely dedicated to their mission, as they'd go to locations such as Kyoshi Island and even Ember Island. So obviously, Aang's favoritism towards Tenzin was pretty extreme. I mean, even when it comes to the Avatar Legacy recap book, the cover features Aang and an adolescent Tenzin as Aang recounts his adventures to him. It's this side of Aang's character, or at least his adult character, that I would have never guessed. Which to me serves to send a message that, yeah, even great people can become horrible parents. And with that, we're hit with the harsh reality that despite being such a prolific humanitarian, having dedicated his life to the world, he failed as a father. And knowing Aang, I can't imagine that he purposefully neglected Bumi and Kaya or have anything but love for them. But still, he wasn't there for them. And based on the things the three of them said, it would seem as though Aang didn't include Bumi or Kaya into his lifestyle at all, not even his vegetarianism. And the two of them make it very clear that they wanted to be included, as air nomad culture is and should be their culture as much as it is Tenzin's, airbending or not. Which really isn't too far-fetched when you remember Aang's induction of a bunch of fangirls into the Air Nation as Air Acolytes, a position which continued on well into Korra's era and served to be integral to the recultivation and furtherance of the Air Nation. But yeah, Kaya and Bumi had to live their lives not only knowing that Tenzin was their father's favorite, but also that if they were airbenders, they'd get that attention too. And that is a terrible position to put any child in. But I think it's especially bad in Bumi's case. I mean, think about it this way. You are the child of the Avatar, the greatest bender in the world, and Katara, the greatest waterbender and healer in the world. And even your two younger siblings are benders. And sure, he wasn't the only one neglected here, but at least Kaya had waterbending going for her. Katara was a pretty reputable waterbending teacher who had clearly taught her daughter everything she knew. And so in desperation, it seems like Bumi adorned the wild personality we all know him for. Despite being the oldest, he would act out and be as childish as possible for the sake of having even a shred of his parents' attention. And this may be my own headcanon, but I feel like as a wacky non-bender, Bumi and Sokka would have gotten along great. So much so that Bumi would probably look up to his uncle Sokka, sparking his interest in the military and things like that. Bumi's competitive spirit was more than likely forged from the countless non-bender jokes his siblings made at his expense. But with all that being said, it's not as if everything was perfect for Tenzin in the long run. Aang forced the massive burden of an entire culture onto his son, so much so that being an air nomad became Tenzin's whole character, with traditions for the most part ruling his decision making, despite flexibility being a governing airbender principle. Furthermore, Tenzin, even as an adult, considered himself to be a failure of an air nomad due to his own spiritual ineptitude. And boy does he beat himself up over it, with a temper very much unlike his late father, which sort of disturbed me. As a child, Aang thoroughly rejected the pressures his people attempted to place upon him as the Avatar, very much favoring the fun-loving and gentle tutelage of Monk Gyatso instead. And so for him to turn around and pretty much force Tenzin into such a similar position is unsettling. And going back to what we said about Bumi's experience as a non-bender, I also find it unsettling that such treatment was facilitated considering how much Aang hated being treated differently as the Avatar by the other Airbender children, who essentially served as his siblings. And I really wish I could say otherwise, but Katara is not much better, as she was inversely the target of persecution as a waterbender, which ultimately resulted in the death of her mother. Not to mention the discrimination she faced as a female waterbender by the Northern Water Tribe. And speaking of Katara, her involvement, or lack thereof, very much calls into question the plausibility of this entire situation for me. The reason being, I just can't imagine that she would let all of this transpire unchecked, considering just how opinionated we knew her to be. Katara was never one to hold her tongue, and was always perceptive and empathetic towards those around her. And so when you couple that with maternal intuition, it becomes really hard to sell this story to me. I mean, these are issues which plague the childhoods of these three, which stood to inhibit them deep into adulthood as well. So for Aang to pass away completely oblivious to this entire situation without hearing a single complaint from his wife Katara is unbelievable. But hey, even if it's not entirely sound, considering the rest of the season, it's probably my favorite inclusion. Because although I may not want to hear that Aang, one of my favorite characters of all time, was a terrible father, it is a fascinating revelation nonetheless. And so I'm really curious how you all might feel about this. Are you repulsed by it all by default simply because it's from the Legend of Korra, or are you able to see some value in it regardless? Please let me know, because by now you should know that I love reading comments. And also, if you have any interest in picking up your very own copy of the Last Airbender Legacy book, or pre-ordering the upcoming hardcover Legacy of the Fire Nation and or Avatar's Chronicles books, please consider using our Amazon affiliate links in the description or with the card at the top of your screen, as doing so really helps out the channel. Now, in the last video, we explained Avatar reincarnation, and without spoiling too much, pretty much broke it down to a particular formula. And with that, a bunch of you seem to be interested in what I believe the Avatar to precede Korra would be like, which is something I originally planned to include in that video, but it ended up being so lengthy that I figured it'd be better suited to a video of its own. But the only issue with that would be the visuals. If I'm gonna do that sort of thing, I wanna do it right, and so if there are any artists out there, or artists you may know of who are pretty good at emulating the Avatar style and are willing to work with me on something like this, please let me know. If you want to reach out to me, feel free to hit me up on Instagram, Twitter, or with an email at SliceofOtaku. But with all that being said, thank you all so much for watching and have an awesome day. I love you.